But my guess is, again, this is a sharp move, and now you're consolidating a little bit. So my guess is you're going to roll over and actually attack that trend line and actually break down. So I'm actually in the camp that the dollar may have topped out in the near term here with this big pop right up here, right? So what's interesting is if you connect, there's a trend line from this top to this top, and it might even go back further, but if you connect these highs, this actually hit the trend line right there, and we've seen that every time it hits the trend line, you get this pullback, kind of retrace. So you did get this pullback, but my guess is, again, this is a sharp move, and now you're consolidating a little bit. So my guess is you're going to roll over and actually attack that trend line and actually break down in the near term. And what's interesting is we know the CPI data is coming out in the next day or so. So that's a chance for that to happen. And really anything that makes us think that the Fed may start to pivot, that could give us a reason why the dollar would actually sell. I do agree. And what's super interesting, right? So if you put parallel lines from this low down over to here, it goes right through these lows here, and you're right on that right now. And then a parallel line actually extends here, which is interesting because what you have here is that, and this is what I think too, is you're going to get an up move, and it'll actually, if you connect these highs, that's kind of the target out there where it tags that. So the micro, you have the macro and the micro, right? The micro is the shorter term move. The micro tells us up, but then you have this bigger channel, which is really a bear flag, right? It's a longer bear flag from this down move. That tells us that the macro over the next 3-6 months is probably to the downside. So I agree 100%. It makes a lot of sense on multiple, and what I love, by the way, whether it's Elliott Wave or other technicals, when they all align, you know you have something that's, the probabilities are much, much higher, right? That would, and you could be the culprit, that could be the culprit. And I think one of the things to keep in mind with the dollar in the near term too is, on a macro perspective, we're seeing so much pressure in the UK. We know that the Bank of England has come out, and there's a lot of central banks that are now getting very worried because the dollar has done so much damage to their currencies and their economies. And it almost makes me think, even though the Fed can't admit it, right? The Fed can't be like, hey guys, we have to weaken the dollar a little bit, or we don't want to, they have to be on alert here, and they may, not subconsciously, but just try to make sure that the dollar doesn't rip in the near term too much, because it could really crack the system, right? It could break the system. No, I do think growth is going to fall off a cliff, and one of the interesting things in the US is, from COVID, you had about $1 trillion in consumer savings. And so there's a lot of pent-up kind of buying that's going to happen here. My concern is the Fed is missing this, right? And they're saying, all right, well, it's still strong. We still have good jobs numbers, so we have to keep raising. But what happens when that trillion runs out mid-next year? All of a sudden, you could have a cliff dive in the economy because the Fed has just over-raised interest rates. And I think that's my big concern, is you could have this big fall-off in the economy. I think it's interesting. We had a nice breakout. Like, if you connect this high all the way down, you have this perfect trend line that came right here, and so you had a nice breakout on the chart. My fear is this, right, is people are starting to speculate, and in trading, that's dangerous. We know that. So you got the up move. Everyone's thinking maybe the judge's decision is going to be positive. Anyone holding it into this, you have to understand it's a gamble, right? When any decision is based off of one person's decision making, it's a risk. And so I'm in the camp that I do think, just like if Bitcoin's going to go lower, if Ethereum's going lower, it's hard for me to imagine that somehow Ripple wouldn't go lower. So I think you're right that you're going to have another wave down to the downside and go lower on Ripple. That's awesome. That's awesome, and I agree with that. I think it makes a lot of sense. You're gonna get that especially with the dollar. If the dollar, like we talked about, does decline, you get the pop up in Ethereum. I love the idea of it breaking this high, because anytime you do that, right, sentiment is going to get bullish very quickly. Especially in crypto, we know people get bullish very quickly. So that's going to then swing it to the point where, when it does move down, you have those sellers that are now starting to panic, and it kind of increases that move to the downside. So from a psychological standpoint, it makes a lot of sense that you're going to get that leg lowered. You always have to stay neutral. You want to be as much of a robot as you can be, right? So you don't get emotionally swayed by everyone else. And if there's one thing that I've trained my brain to do, is when everyone starts talking about something, I'm like, maybe that's the time to, maybe not necessarily short it, but at least stay on the sidelines in the very least. And I think it's really important to recognize that, because especially in social media, you start to see more and more of that kind of catching people and drawing them in at the wrong time. And we saw it last year on Bitcoin at 65, 69,000. I mean, it was just mass hysteria. And then what people have to realize is that the way the market works is, at mass hysteria, anyone who is even somewhat tempted or even slightly tempted to buy Bitcoin was going to finally get drawn into the market because it was the most emotional period, so much greed. And once everyone gets drawn in, you have to ask yourself, okay, well, if everyone's in, who's left to buy it? And that's where tops are made, is when you finally run out of buyers, there's no one left. And again, we're using a simplified form. There's always like one or two people, but you need a lot of people to keep momentum going up, especially where as Bitcoin got higher, some people will come out of the woodwork and say, I'm going to take profits. And then it downticks a little, which scares just a few people. Then they sell, and then it becomes this kind of snowball. That's the thing. Anyone who's traded for a long enough period, you've been through the hardships, and the market has a way of reminding you that you're not in charge and that you need to be careful, right? Anytime you get cocky, anytime you think you're invincible, the market is always there to remind you that you're not.